The significance of the Constellation goes back to the early 40s when Howard Hughes contracted with Lockheed to design and develop the fastest, most powerful airliner for public service. So the Constellations actually entered passenger service in 1946, following World War II. Prior to the war, it was mostly the barnstormers and those thrill seekers that got on airplanes, and usually people took the train. It was a safer, more staid mode of transportation. The war brought about the fact that airplanes were safe and somewhat reliable and much quicker form of transportation.
A Constellation could fly from Chicago to New York in 3 hours with a crew of only 6. The Century took 16 hours, and although its service crews worked the entire run, the operating crews were changed 8 times, each of them getting a day's pay for working about 100 miles. Some business people still preferred the restfulness of the train, but it was increasingly hard for railroads to compete on speed and labor costs. The Century was a perfect run for businessmen, but even it had a hard time competing. By then, it was a 16-hour trip, which meant that passengers left New York right after the office closed for the day, and they'd be in Chicago when the office opened the next morning. In the meantime, they'd have 2 fine meals, cooked to order on board, a good night's sleep, and they'd be shaved and ready to go. But in the end, the speed of air travel was the deciding factor for most businessmen.
It was generally businessmen. They were dressed up in suits. We put on our hats and our gloves for boarding and deplaning, and if there were, by chance, a female on board, she had on her hat and gloves also. So it was a time that's different than now.
There were a lot of businessmen who were frequent flyers, the same route often, and they would greet you as they came on board like they knew you and put their hats in the overhead racks and have a seat.
I'm not sure how much we've gained. In the jet age, the business person who wants to be in Chicago for a morning meeting generally gets up at 3 in the morning, schleps out to LaGuardia, catches a 6 a.m. flight, and then has to get in from O'Hare during rush hour. I know, I've done it, but comfort aside, the train's cost structure couldn't compete, and the trains couldn't keep up on the revenue side of the ledger either.
Mail and express revenue or passenger revenue can make a train profitable or unprofitable. In the case of the Century, after the mid-50s, the magic numbers were not often attained, and with the diminution of mail and the removal of the RPO cars, that certainly didn't help the economics of the train.
The biggest blow, especially for the corridor and short-haul services of the Great Steel Fleet, came from highways. The New York State Thruway opened in the 1950s along a route that paralleled the New York Central from Yonkers to Buffalo and beyond.
Went from there to Syracuse as assistant general manager, and my mother was still living in Buffalo, and we decided we would go up to Buffalo for Thanksgiving. And mind you, I had a private car that would be the general manager. The New York State Thruway had been opened, and we got in the Chevrolet and put our daughter in the back seat, drove up to Buffalo, and I remember thinking at that time, there's not much future in the passenger business for the railroads.
New York Central kept track as the State Thruway kept opening towards Buffalo. That segment would lose that much business. And of course, that's government supported. The bus and the highway people didn't have to maintain it. You just pay a slight user tax. The railroad has to plow their own right-of-way and so on. The railroad is taxed on everything. The highway is not. So you just couldn't compete with that. That didn't exist in the 20s when the Century was a gold mine.
Even as New York State was building the Thruway, President Dwight D. Eisenhower proposed the interstate highway system, which would build similar roads nationwide. Ironically, Ike had been master of ceremonies when the 1948 Century debuted at Grand Central before he became president. Between 1948 and 1954, the Central's passenger revenues fell 22%. In the next 10 years, they fell by an additional 50%. As an economy measure, in 1958, the Central combined a secondary train, the Commodore Vanderbilt, with the Century. For the first time, coaches were in the same train with the Century's Pullmans. The Century and the Commodore Vanderbilt were still billed as separate trains, and the coach passengers weren't permitted to venture into the Pullmans, but it was an ominous development. The competing Pennsylvania Railroad was quick to seize on the fact that its Broadway Limited was still all Pullman.